published a research showing that diabetes was reversible using gastric bypass, the community could no longer say that once a diabetic, always a diabetic. The community, the medical community, could no longer hold to the old position that had been wrong all along, that diabetes was not reversible. That once you have it, you've had it, you're going to have it the rest of your life, and all you can do is manage it. Okay, it's just simply not true. Simply not true. And so we have to dig deep into the causes of a condition. That's what gives us the opportunity to actually reverse a condition. So now we fast forward into 2019, and there is now a growing number of us health professionals that are not only saying, but we're recognizing from personal clinical experience that Alzheimer's and the cognitive decline of Alzheimer's is also reversible. Now, let me phrase that carefully. I was asked by a neurologist recently at a conference where we were both speaking. He came and says, "Wes, you're not actually telling people you can reverse Alzheimer's, are you?" And I said to him, I looked at him in the eye and says, "Define Alzheimer's." And that's one of the things we're going to talk about tonight, because it all depends on how you define a condition. Okay, if you define the condition according to the very definitive criteria, okay, then you can actually, whether it's diabetes or Alzheimer's or mild cognitive impairment or hypertension or heart disease or whatever it is, okay, then you know at what point you have to reach for it no longer to meet the criteria, right? Logic says that. When I was first being challenged about the notion that diabetes was reversible, okay, I would always say, well, how do you define diabetes? There's only one definition for diabetes: a blood sugar or a test related to a blood sugar, like the hemoglobin A1C, that has now gotten high enough to cross the line into diabetes. That's the only definition of diabetes. Therefore, it would be logical, I would think, and most logical people would think, that if you're now changing your ways, your lifestyle, such that that number, whether it's a fasting blood sugar or a 2-hour blood sugar after a meal, or a hemoglobin A1C, which is that caramelization test of sugar binding to the proteins in your blood, okay, any one of those three criteria, each of which is a separate way of diagnosing diabetes, once it reaches down past that cutoff point, how can anybody say that they still have diabetes? Well, there'd be some discussion about, well, you know, they still have the predisposition, they still have the genetics, they still need to manage this, and that's all true, but they don't have diabetes anymore. And so they need, the medical community in general, all of us have to accept that once you reach that cutoff, that tip is gone until they change back, right? If we get lazy and what we're doing, and we stop exercising, we stop paying attention to the dietary strategies that got us to reverse it in the first place, then it'll come back, right? It could certainly come back. So we can acknowledge that and still be true to the diagnosis itself. I oftentimes use this example for people who are still struggling with this idea that diabetes is reversible or that cognitive decline in any way is reversible. So what if the issue was just you were obese? Okay, 67% of Americans are either overweight or obese. So this is a very normal problem that we have. It's normal to be overweight in our country, right? It's normal. It's average. And so let's just say somebody came to me and said, "Dr. Youngberg, I know I'm obese, and I know I need to lose 60 pounds to get to an optimal weight for me. And can you help me reverse my obesity?" What if I said this? Well, I can help you lose that 60 pounds, but you're still going to be obese. Because see, once you're obese, you're always going to be obese, no matter what your numbers show. What would you say to me if you were the patient asking me for help? You say, "You're crazy," and you'd be right. I would be a lunatic to say that, and so that's why when we use that example, transfer that to this whole issue of diabetes. If you're struggling with the notion that diabetes cannot be undone, think of that example, because it's a numbers game. And the beauty of Diabetes Undone is that it shows you how to go even beyond the numbers game. Even for those few of us who still are going to have some level of diabetes or pre-diabetes after we've improved our health a lot, that I would rather be diabetic and following the Diabetes Undone principles than be non-diabetic and not be following the Diabetes Undone principles. Because my risk by following the principles, even if my blood sugars are still running higher than optimal, by following those principles of Diabetes Undone, I am going to be at much lower risk of cancer. I'm going to be at much lower risk of having a heart attack or a stroke. I'm going to be at much lower risk of getting an autoimmune disease, and I'm going to be at much, much lower risk of ever getting Alzheimer's. And my opportunity to actually reverse aspects of all of those diseases go way up, even if my blood sugars are still running high. Okay? So, in other words, I'm trying to help you understand that it's the process that makes us healthy. Some people get so caught up in the numbers that they're ready to give up. They're ready to give up even though intuitively they know they're doing so much better. Right? So we have to be careful what fallacies we buy into in this era of diabetes being, a scourge of society and Alzheimer's being a scourge of society. Okay, so another way of saying this is Diabetes Undone is the first step in Alzheimer's Undone. So I work with a lot of patients who come to me. In fact, I'm actually seeing more patients now, Dr. Lowe, in the area of Alzheimer's and cognitive decline than I am in the official area of diabetes. But it's actually all the same thing. It's all the same thing. It's just that they're coming for different reasons. And so what would you be most interested in? Preventing diabetes or preventing Alzheimer's? What would be you're most interested in? Reversing diabetes or reversing the cognitive decline associated with Alzheimer's? Yeah, so diabetes in a sense isn't even a disease. It's just a number like a high blood pressure. Okay? The actual disease are the complications that come after the fact. Alzheimer's, by definition, is the complication. Right? It's the endpoint issue of gradually over years and decades losing cognitive function, sometimes rapidly, to the point where we're no longer functional in daily life. And I'm happy to say that even people who have experienced decline for decades and are at an advanced diagnosis of Alzheimer's, there's even hope for them. Now, I'm not saying that we take these advanced cases of Alzheimer's and we're going to reverse it all the way up to they don't have any cognitive issue at all. I'm not saying that. Okay? That's not even that important at this point. What's important is that we improve functionality. That's the operative word in Alzheimer's is how functional are you? I just had a patient that talked to me on Thursday for the first time, and I'm going to share that story tomorrow morning. Okay, so I won't tell you much of the story right now, but she clearly had over 12, 13 years of major functional decline relative to cognitive changes, so much so that she lost her business that she had developed. She was doing very well, running a small business, and it just crashed. Why? Because she had lost her ability cognitively to do that. Is that a functional problem? Yeah. Now, when I talked with her, she actually talked very clearly and communicated effectively about her concerns with me. And by the way, most people who have Alzheimer's actually can communicate quite nicely back and forth. It's only after you know them for a while that you can tell that they don't remember certain things that you told them, yesterday or sometimes 10 minutes ago. But otherwise, they can be very social and very engaging and very good communicators. Okay, so different parts of function change. Everybody who has cognitive decline declines in different ways. And so there's many people that we see driving on the roads that we are doing business with, that we're interacting with throughout in society actually have progressive forms of cognitive decline, and we never pay attention. We wonder why they're so easily upset sometimes. We wonder, why they act the way they do or why they do the things that they do. And in fact, it is many times related to actual progression of cognitive decline. And one of the main messages that I want to give you tonight is that the most likely or the most common cause and frequent driver of cognitive decline in Alzheimer's is insulin resistance. It's that pre-diabetic syndrome that comes way before diabetes. And so diabetes is a further progressive aspect of the main dysfunction that drives Alzheimer's. Therefore, whenever I see a patient initially who expresses to me any concern about cognition, I struggle finding words once in a while, they might say to me. Or my memory isn't quite what it used to be. There's all kinds of different aspects of this. The very first thing I think of clinically for them is to evaluate their level of insulin resistance, because my job as a clinician is to fix as many of the underlying factors that are driving their condition. Unfortunately, what has happened up until recently in the neurologic community is it's all been about diagnosis and then giving the bad news. Yes, you have a memory problem. I see from your family history that this isn't unusual. We're so sorry. We'd be happy to help you with maybe some medicines. Well, by the way, we know from studies with all these medicines that they actually don't work. They help with symptoms a little bit early on, but we know that they actually don't change the course of the disease. They don't slow down the cognitive damage that occurs over time. It's just basically giving us a little bit of time with a little bit less symptoms. That's not, if I'm a patient with cognitive decline, okay, and this is so common now, cognitive decline is so common, it's normative. In other words, expect it to happen to you. I expect it to happen to me. That's why I'm interested in this topic, okay, because I want to do everything possible for myself to greatly limit any potential for progression, but even more importantly, reverse whatever tendencies I already have. And that is available to us at least 80% of the time. That's good news. That gives us hope. Okay, so we have this thing with insulin resistance. It was Sir William Osler who, one of these masters of medicine in previous decades, he said, there are in truth no specialties in medicine, since to know fully many of the most important diseases, a man must be familiar with their manifestations in many organs. So I love this. In other words, if we're going to be good at addressing diabetes, not just managing it, not just lowering the blood sugars with one more medicine every so many years or months even, okay, but actually addressing the cause of the problem, we have to understand what's going on, not just in one area of the body, but in all areas of the body. See, this whole issue with insulin resistance, this is something that affects every single organ of the body. In fact, you could argue that essentially all chronic disease has as one of its underlying drivers insulin resistance. All chronic disease. You could argue, well, I do argue, that the number one driver of heart disease is not cholesterol, not even close. Not even close. Okay, it's not even high blood pressure. That's closer. High blood pressure is an issue, no question. But based on really good research with thousands and thousands of subjects, this is NIH research, the biggest driver of having a heart attack is insulin resistance. Now, insulin resistance is a little bit hard to understand. What does that mean, insulin resistance, right? And so we're going to be talking about that as we move forward here. It's also the number one driver, as I said, of Alzheimer's or cognitive decline in general. It's the biggest driver of high blood pressure. Okay, it's the biggest driver. It's a driver that causes inflammation throughout the entire body. So it's a driver for autoimmune diseases, and it's one of the biggest drivers of cancer. There was a wonderful study in the medical journal Diabetes Care. This is a few years ago now. The journal Diabetes Care is considered by most physicians to be the top medical journal in the area of diabetes medicine around the world. This study actually showed that people who were taking more insulin or taking insulin for many years were at much higher risk of developing cancer. Now, don't misunderstand me here. I'm not saying if you're taking insulin, stop insulin. That's not my message. My message is make sure that you're doing something to improve your body's sensitivity to insulin, so either you don't need to inject as much, or your body, your own pancreas, doesn't have to make as much. Your pancreas can make 10 to 20 times more insulin than it should have to for decades. And that excess insulin drives cancer risk. It's a growth hormone after all. Okay, and it'll not only initiate cancers like breast cancer, colon cancer, ovarian cancer, prostate cancer, and skin cancer even. It's a major driver for those cancers. And but it also causes a cancer, once it's already initiated, to grow faster. In other words, clinically, I have patients that always, not always, from time to time I have patients that contact me and say, hey, I was just diagnosed with colon cancer or prostate cancer. Can you help me? And so the first thing I do is, well, I actually don't treat cancer. Says, but I can help your body and your immune system be healthier so that you're doing your part in addressing the problem. First thing I do, evaluate insulin resistance. Actually, I literally do a 4-hour glucose tolerance test where they get a sweet drink, a sugar drink, and then we measure their blood sugar levels over 4 hours and their insulin levels over 4 hours. And if they're producing a lot of insulin to try, even if their blood sugars are perfect, but in order to have perfect blood sugars, you have to produce all this extra insulin, that's going to drive cancer risk. Okay? And so the diabetes undone philosophy, okay, if that will be promoted in this 8-week program that is kicking off this Sunday, is all about improving insulin sensitivity. In other words, You don't, you don't have to have diabetes or even pre-diabetes to benefit from this program. Okay? All that's necessary is for you to want to improve your health. That's the only prerequisite to joining the type of program. Obviously, if you have diabetes or pre-diabetes, you have even more motivation because you want to undo not only the high blood sugars, but also the insulin resistance that led to it in the first place. Now, so let's keep going here. What's more of this relationship between diabetes, type 2 diabetes, and Alzheimer's? Dr. Suzanne de Lamont, who's a neuropathologist at Brown University, back in 1995, started noticing in her own research at the University Medical Center that as she took the brain tissue of men and women who had died with Alzheimer's and did tests on them, she discovered that brain tissue was severely resistant to insulin. And so she was the one that started the discussion in the medical community amongst her colleagues as neurologists and pathologists that insulin resistance, which had previously been primarily a concern for cardiovascular disease, primarily a concern for diabetes, was actually the main driver metabolically and pathophysiologically for Alzheimer's as well. This became so well studied that Alzheimer's soon became basically reclassified as insulin resistance of the brain, commonly referred to now as type 3 diabetes. Alzheimer's is type 3 diabetes because it is insulin resistance of the brain. Therefore, once again, the first strategy, the first thing we need to do well, if we have any concern about cognition, is to reverse insulin resistance. And we know how to do that. We know how to do that. And that's really why the program Diabetes Undone was developed. A better name for it would actually be insulin resistance undone. But nobody would know what that means, okay, unless they went to a kickoff weekend like this, right? So diabetes is the tip of the iceberg. It's the very tip of the iceberg. The real problem isn't the blood sugars, okay? The real problem is the metabolic mess, that huge gargantuan part of the iceberg that lies below the surface of the ocean. Right? You know that 90% of icebergs are below the surface of the ocean. It's huge. That represents insulin resistance. That's what we got to change. Okay, it wasn't the tip of the iceberg that sank the Titanic. It was the ice underneath that sank the Titanic. Okay, so Dr. Lamont has written many studies. You can Google her at Brown University, and she's published a tremendous amount of research on this concept that Alzheimer's is insulin resistance. Now, to give some additional credibility, especially maybe for some of you that are trained in healthcare or medicine, the most effective, one of the most effective diagnostic tests for evaluating whether somebody has a pathology in their brain associated with Alzheimer's is a PET scan with fluorodeoxyglucose, with FDG, where they basically inject a radioactive form of glucose into the body that then floats through the brain, and then the PET scan is able to analyze whether the brain is using that glucose, whether it's able to actually get that blood sugar into the neuron, into the brain cell itself. Because you see, insulin resistance is defined by very simple terms. If you have sugar in your blood, floating around your blood, but it can't get into your muscle cells or your liver cells or any other cell of your body, then what happens? If it can't get into the cell and get used, what happens? The level of sugar in the blood does what? It just keeps going up. Okay? And so that's how we diagnose diabetes. It's as the sugar levels go up, that's actually not the problem. The problem is that the cells of the body have stopped accepting glucose properly, and it's the insulin resistance of the cell that actually causes the risk, the complications, the kidney damage and the blindness and all these other problems. It's that insulin resistance that then forces the pancreas to make more insulin, and that extra insulin then tries to compensate to bring that blood sugar down and into the cells where it can be used for energy. So this test, when this PET scan, when it demonstrates that the brain cells are not able to absorb that glucose, that blood sugar very well, that means that there is insulin resistance of the brain. Now, this test is not Medicare approved, and it's about $6,000 or so, so understandably, it's not a test that everybody gets. Your doctor's not going to offer you that test if you have Medicare, and there's arguments for Medicare, covering that because it's a good test. Okay, but I could also argue that there's simple ways to assess whether somebody has cognitive decline that take 15 minutes and a little test that we'll show you in a little bit that can get us started on a program, and that instead of that $6,000 on a PET scan that just tells you what you kind of already know, right? We can do other, blood sugar and insulin measurements in the body to tell whether you have insulin resistance. So I don't really promote that test very much because, most of my patients don't have $6,000 laying around to just spend on whatever, right? But I'm telling you this because this helps us understand the credibility of this notion that Alzheimer's is primarily a type 3 diabetes that can be undone. Various aspects of that cognitive decline can be undone even in later stages. All right. So defining dementia, as I mentioned earlier, dementia is really an end-stage definition. It's a condition that is described as the actual complicating effect of some risk factors. Whereas diabetes is not defined that way. Diabetes is defined as a high blood sugar, and people can have high blood sugars and they can go along their merry way for decades without realizing that every day they don't address that, they're getting closer and closer to end-stage complications, right? Kidney failure, blindness, retinal tears, amputations, heart attacks, strokes. And if that doesn't worry us enough, Alzheimer's, right? Because that's the one that gets my attention more than all the other ones. So it's interesting, as we define dementia, it's important to recognize that it is a decline in mental ability severe enough to interfere with the activities of daily living. So there's really 3 levels of cognitive decline that are being driven, again, primarily by this insulin resistance phenomenon related to blood sugars and excess insulin production, trying to control for that high blood sugar. And it starts with a condition that we call subjective cognitive decline. This is where somebody can actually take a test, like I'm going to show you in a minute, and they do well. They score at least 27 out of 30 points. They may score 30 points. But But after they've done well on the test and they're considered to be normal based on cognitive norms, they will confide in me. Says, well, okay, I'm normal. That's good. But I'm not what I used to be. And that's the bottom line. See, we spend too much time in medicine comparing ourselves to other people, right? To where are we from a statistical perspective? And I argue that that's the worst way to determine whether you're healthy or not, comparing yourselves to other people. Why? Because it's normal to have Alzheimer's. It's normal to have heart disease. It's normal to get cancer. It's normal to be hypertensive. It's normal to be, all those things. That's normal. That's what's expected. That's average. We don't want to be normal. We want to be optimal. So always striving to see what's the optimal approach. And when we're managing or trying to reverse a given aspect of cognitive decline, or any disease for that matter, our job is to find as many risk factors that are driving that condition. It's certainly especially true in Alzheimer's or mild cognitive impairment. And so as we find those risk factors, we treat that risk factor not just down to normal, but to optimal. This is really critical to understand because there's a huge difference between normal and optimal. On the lab tests, there's a huge difference. And so unless you get those lab tests as close as possible to optimal, you're missing multiple opportunities to get your body physiologically to that tipping point where your body's actually starting to heal. And by body, I include brain as the most important piece of the body. Brain and body are not separate issues. Brain is part of the body. Brain should be the master of the body. The brain should be taken care of first and foremost because that's what takes care of the rest of the body. Okay, so mild cognitive impairment is the next step. And this is where now we can actually test on that 15-minute memory-related, executive function-related exam how you're doing. And now it's gone down into a more noticeable cognitive decline that's still early. You still do very well in society. You can still hold down a job very well. But there's a little bit of cognitive decline there, and that's what puts us on notice. Okay, we now definitely want to start doing something about it, because if we don't, that there's an expected drop in cognitive function every 3 to 4 months, unless you change it, unless you address the causes of the problem. And then we get into the actual levels of dementia, which Alzheimer's represents 80% of all of dementia. Okay? In fact, I would argue that if you're going to have dementia, you want Alzheimer's. Now, that may sound strange, okay? But the other forms of dementia, like frontal temporal lobe dementias or Lewy body disease, you don't want those. You don't want those for sure. Okay, there's still ways to manage those. Okay, but it's actually a lot easier to address Alzheimer's than it is those other rarer forms of dementia. Okay, so here's just a quick sneak peek to one of the options of the Montreal Cognitive Assessment. It's a 30-point scale. We ask you to do different tasks, visual spatially, naming animals, and do various other tests, and remember 5 words 10 minutes later, and how many of those words do you remember? Are you oriented to space and time? Do you know what day it is, and so forth? And every point counts. Okay, so there's point differentials for whether it's normal or mild cognitive impairment or early dementia in the form of Alzheimer's, etc. I don't have time tonight to share a lot of case studies with you. How many of you were at the whole conference? Okay, so that's why I'm not going to share too many, because last time I pretty much spent the whole time doing case studies, so I want to go beyond that. I had a patient that I mentioned at the whole conference, and I'll just be brief on this. She was so advanced in Alzheimer's that she scored 0 out of 30. She is essentially in a more of a vegetative state most of the day. She would sit in her room with the TV on and she wasn't there. She just checked out. She would not smile. She wouldn't laugh. She would just be there. Very sad. Very, very, very sad. Her husband wasn't satisfied with normative care. Her husband had talked to me years before at a Diabetes Undone program, actually, because she had diabetes, and she had been working on her diabetes. But you know, sometimes we need more support, right? We need to go through it and go with a group, right? Get involved with a group and get support and ongoing support. And she didn't like to exercise. She didn't really like to eat healthy. And how can you blame somebody who, you know, basically has advanced Alzheimer's? Somebody with advanced levels of cognitive decline can't make decisions for themselves. In other words, if we're a family member, we shouldn't leave it up to them, right? It's kind of it's like working with a toddler. You don't just ask your toddler, well, what do you want to eat today, honey? Right? I mean, they're going to say, well, pancakes and Fruit Loops and, you know, ice cream, you know, every time, right? I mean, so we have to recognize what the ability is of the family member to make those decisions, and as a caregiver, as a husband or wife or brother or sister or caregiver, if we understand these concepts and apply these Diabetes Undone principles, there's great power for healing to take place. To keep it short, this lady, the husband figured out how to get her exercise. She wouldn't go out exercising with him, but she'd go shopping with him. Hey, honey, let's go shopping. Sure, let's go shopping. And so he'd get a grocery cart, and she'd hold on to the grocery cart. They'd walk around the perimeter of the grocery store for 30 minutes every day. Took commitment from the husband, but he was committed to making it work. And exercise is one of the most powerful strategies to get the brain working again, gets blood circulating to the brain. And then they added the right meals, the right food to that. Instead, as she'd going down the grocery store, she'd grab some donuts, put it in the cart, then she'd grab some Fruit Loops, and then she'd grab some Pop-Tarts, and then her husband would grab the Pop-Tarts and put them back in the shelf. So he got his exercise while she was getting her exercise. And it was good. And then, so all these little things were figured out along the way. And you know that she went from being a complete, and the other part was that she had full-blown sundowning syndrome, 4 hours every evening. Got confused and agitated and would pack her clothes and be out the door to go visit mom, go be with mom, who'd been dead for 30 years. This went on for 4 years. Okay, can you imagine the disruption in the family? The husband would spend a couple hours the next morning repacking or unpacking the suitcases and putting them back. Man, what a patient man that was. Well, you know that for the last 6 months? He says, I have my wife back. She laughs at my jokes. She smiles at me every morning. She tells me she loves me. And she's communicating in full sentences. Before it was just like, she couldn't talk. Okay, I mean, why? Because the brain is reached that tipping point. She's getting enough of the strategies, and we've done enough of the testing to figure out what the problem areas were and fix each of them, and collectively, all of a sudden, the brain starts turning on again. It's like a light switch comes on. And so she technically still has Alzheimer's, but does it matter? No, she's essentially completely functional again. And also she's not progressing, even though she was pretty much vegetative. There's a problem with that, yes, but what about situations like completely not being able to take care of toiletry needs? And so those of you that have dealt with family members or friends with Alzheimer's know what I'm talking about. If you haven't, you have no idea. You have no idea. So that's why when I see patients once in a while, or families that come in and say, well, you know, it's really not that bad. I'm not sure that we can do this. I'm not sure that we can really, you know, all this testing and blood test and changing the diet, and, you know, we want to go for quality of life. And so I say, you know what, I totally respect whatever decision you make, but I think it's imperative for me to explain to you that you have no idea what you're meaning by quality of life. Because this is not going to be the way it is for much more than a couple months. This is going to progress from the point where I just can't remember where I put my keys to I can't remember how to wipe myself when I go to the bathroom. And that's just the beginning. Okay, so quality of life is the whole reason we do this. Okay, and so if we can just hold on to preventing or even just slowing any progression of cognitive decline, the family has been successful beyond measure. Because progression of cognitive decline is ugly, ugly, ugly. Okay, and hardly anybody really understands what that means. Because it can always get worse. And it will get worse unless we address what? The underlying triggers. So that's our key to figure that out. So I always at the very beginning of working with patients, I say there's 3 goals here. Because especially if we have somebody coming in that has the early symptoms of, man, I can't think of that word, and everybody else in the room knows what the word is that I can't say. I know what it is, I just can't say it. Right? And we've all had that a little bit. Maybe many of us have had that. But it's embarrassing, right? I had a patient just Thursday tell me, another patient, she said, you know, I run a big Bible study group for a women's group at our church, and I've been doing that for 15 years. She says, I'm giving it up. And I said, why? Because I've been treating it for other things. I go like, whoa, time out. Why do you want to give that up? She says, I can't remember people's names anymore. And I stumble through some of my Bible studies, and just something wrong with my brain. I'm going like, okay, we got to regroup here. Okay, we got to fix this. Okay, there's something that we're not doing right. We got to dig in and find what those risk factors are, because there are risk factors if we're willing to look. Okay, and she started having this new sense of hope. Okay, yeah, that's what we need to do. I said, don't give up. Don't give up your position without first working on the strategies. Okay, so we want to slow, number one, and everybody can slow progression. We find that that's 100%er. Number 2 goal is to stop progression. In my experience over the years, that's about a 90%er. Now I know that's a huge statement. 90% can, if they're following the comprehensive approach, if they're addressing the insulin resistance, if they're addressing the other risk factors that we discovered, and fixing those, owning them, being accountable, following the protocol, 90% of people can slow down, or not just slow down, but actually stop progression. That's exciting. And then, what about reversing aspects of cognitive decline? We're not saying reversing everything, right? We're talking about reversing things enough so that we're functional again, right? And that Dr. Bredesen and others have published research. 80% of the time, that's possible. 80% of the time, that's possible. So here's Dr. Bredesen at a training program that I attended in 2016. This is the most recent published paper of reversal cognitive decline in 100 patients that I had the privilege to co-author with Dr. Bredesen back in October in the Journal of Alzheimer's Disease and Parkinson's. In other words, when somebody says, oh, there's no research, there's no evidence anywhere that cognitive decline is reversible, How many case studies you want? Here's 100. I could have given 100 myself. It just takes an hour and a half to fill out each case study. I didn't have 150 hours to do it. Okay, but there's the other 11 or other 14 clinicians who participated in providing case studies. They could have probably provided 100 each themselves. Okay, so it's amazing what we see. This is another paper that I had a privilege to co-author as well in the American Journal of Lifestyle Medicine in May of 2018 that actually presents several of my case studies that were dramatic improvements in Alzheimer's. Okay, now here's one of the first things that we want to do. Besides, no matter what we're trying to reverse or prevent, whether it's type 2 diabetes or type 3 diabetes, okay, it's important that we understand our genetic risk. I recommend this to every single patient. Just this morning, I was reading a report from the City of Hope, right, that's well known and respected for their research in cancer. And they received a huge grant. They didn't disclose how much money they got, but it must have been a lot of money. I mean, it was probably at least $10 million. And you know what the grant was for? The grant was for actually, their goal is to, within 6 years, find a cure for type 1 diabetes. Right? So that's a tall order. But what was so cool about their research is that they have collected a group of MDs and PhDs who understand genomics, who understand that in the new era, to find a cure for conditions like this, we can no longer treat everybody as a statistic. Like what we're currently doing, not we, but many are doing for diabetes. Everybody gets treated under a certain guideline. Okay, if this happens, then you get this. You just get metformin, or you get glipizide, or you get insulin. And everybody, it's kind of cookie cutter. It's assumed that everybody's the same when we know that nobody's the same. Okay, we're all uniquely, genetically different. Okay, and so we have now entered, after the Human Genome Project was completed some 13 years ago, we have now entered into an age of personalized care. That we have to start taking advantage of genetics, because if we don't, we're missing the boat. And so that's why everybody should study genetics and do the tests necessary to understand. And one of the things, whether we're type 2 diabetic or have heart disease or have Alzheimer's risk, there's tests that give us clues of what we can do to optimize those biochemical pathways. So the ApoE4 gene, you know that 1 out of 4 of us in the United States carry a gene that is associated with a dramatic increased risk of Alzheimer's. Here's a little example. Okay, this is from the 23andMe database that you can get for under $200, one-time test, and the MTHFR support report, which is 50 pages of this, all different genes. And you see that this patient here has the ApoE epsilon 4. The ApoE4 is in the yellow, meaning the plus minus. Plus means one copy of the mutated Alzheimer's gene, but also one copy of the non-mutated. So that's why it's a plus minus here. And but do you know that just having one copy of the Alzheimer's gene, the ApoE4, increases your personal risk roughly 500%. Some studies say 200 to 400%. Other studies say 500%. But here's the bottom line. That's only true if you either don't know about it or you're not doing anything about it. So that's why I say the more we know about our genes, the more excited we can be about being able to undo the negative effects of those genes. And so there's no reason why we shouldn't take advantage of knowing our risk for Alzheimer's or heart disease or whatever, because by knowing our risk, that helps us understand the importance of having a protocol in place that undoes, that neutralizes that risk. That's the beauty of genomics. It tells us precisely where we need to work biochemically, physiologically, to change our risk in terms of nutrients, etc., that we need to follow. So if you do not have the Alzheimer's gene, if you're an ApoE33, you don't have the Alzheimer's gene, which is 3/4 of the American population, your average risk of becoming down with Alzheimer's by age 84 is 50-50. Did you hear what I just said? Okay, in other words, even if you don't have the gene, your average risk of developing Alzheimer's is about 40, some say 50% by the mid-80s. Okay, that's, in other words, I'm paying attention. I don't have the gene, but I had a grandfather who had Alzheimer's, and that's just as risky as having the gene. Okay, so I'm paying attention, and we all should be as well. If you have one copy of the gene, that happens 10 years earlier. So you have a 50% chance of having Alzheimer's by the age of 75 now with one copy of the gene. Two copies, it's another 7 or 10 years earlier than that, at age 68, some say 65. Okay? So now, what does this mean? If we have two copies, we may as well just throw in the towel? Okay, no, it's time to get busy undoing the risk, right? That's what that means. All right, so I love this statement from Cicero, who basically was an orator and philosopher around the time of Christ, and he said, old age must be resisted and its deficiencies supplied. Don't you love that? Talk about an upbeat, proactive approach to life. Like stop, walking around and moping about your problem. Just as we get older, we just get smarter, right? We figure out what else we can do to undo the negative effect of whatever our genes represent risk-wise. So basically what that means to me is that bad genes must be detected, be resisted, and its deficiency supplied. Genetic mutations precisely tell us that now the dysfunctional enzyme that is coded by that mutated gene requires a lot more of the cofactors that catalyze the enzymatic reaction. And what are those cofactors? In every case, they're vitamins and minerals. Okay? So when we know we have a genetic mutation in any category of disease, we know precisely what nutrients we can ramp up to improve, and that starts with a whole, optimal, plant-based diet. That's where it starts, because that's where, there's all kinds of nutrients in those foods that we don't even understand in science yet. So don't think that you can just supplement all your woes away, okay, and just eat whatever you want. It's never going to work. Okay? On the corollary to that, however, is that don't think that if you eat a 100% plant-based diet and you're eating really clean, that there's no value of appropriate supplementation, because that's a denial to what we already know from genomics. That's what genomics is explaining to us, is that we need to optimize certain areas biochemically to help neutralize the genetic risk associated with that mutation. So in other words, we need to take advantage of every single strategy that's available to us, and not just say, well, I'm doing this. I exercise every day, so that because of that, I can eat whatever I want, or I can ignore all the other health principles. Right? I frequently am asked, which is the most important of the health laws? Sound familiar? Right? Remember when Jesus was asked, well, by the lawyers, what's the most important commandment? He blew them away, right? He says, love God and love your neighbor. Okay, and so because there was an argument back in that day of, which is the most important commandment. That the legalists were arguing that. And Jesus just said, no, you just love God with all your heart and love your neighbor as yourself. Wow, that's beautiful, isn't it? Well, the same thing is true with health principles. What are the most important health principles? Probably the ones that we're not following. Okay? Because each of us have gifts and interests that make us more likely to follow one area of health and do fairly well in it, and because of that, kind of ignore the other areas because we feel self-satisfied in the area that we are following. Right? And now, we all do this a little bit. I do this myself. So we have to catch myself sometimes. Hey, what am I missing? What am I not doing optimally? One of the challenges that I struggle with is getting to bed on time. I missed being here last year, so I made sure the last 2 weeks I got to bed at 10 o'clock, But I like to stay up and work on my books and read and relax and so forth. I like that. I tend to be a night owl, but that's not healthy. Okay, even if it seems like I'm getting away with it, it's not healthy. The brain can't heal. The brain can't get rid of beta amyloid plaque if it's not going to bed at a reasonable time. And reasonable is way before midnight, right? Okay, so we need to supply those deficiencies. Now, tying it back in to diabetes, there is an interesting study that diabetes, type 2 diabetes, can actually also be referred to as Alzheimer's of the pancreas. So you heard me say earlier that Alzheimer's can be referred to as diabetes of the brain, but it's just as true that type 2 diabetes can be referred to as Alzheimer's of the pancreas. Why? Because this islet amyloid, this beta amyloid-like substance, it's a cousin of the beta amyloid, forms cytotoxic amyloid deposits in the pancreatic beta cells and is a key histopathophysiologic hallmark of type 2 diabetes. So there's, it never ceases to amaze me. After studying, ever since college, ever since 1979, I've been studying health. And it never ceases to baffle me how almost every day I run into another concept that has been in the medical literature for decades, and somehow I missed it. This has been documented for decades. And I'm like an expert in diabetes, and I totally missed it all those years. There's a lot of this going on. So unfortunately, some doctors, they study really hard during school, and then they go like, well, I know it now, and I can just kind of cruise. You learn a lot more after you graduate. You better learn a lot more after you graduate, else you're not going to be a very good doctor. Okay, so all right. So now, by the way, the reason this is important is that we're now understanding that one of the causes of both Alzheimer's and pancreatic failure that ultimately leads to type 2 diabetes, okay, is this cytotoxic substance, this beta amyloid in the brain and a similar amyloid in the pancreas. And so we're thinking, well, if we could just get rid of that amyloid product, everything would be perfect. We'd be good, right? There's billions of dollars being spent right now on new drugs that remove beta amyloid from the brain. Here's the problem. Beta amyloid is actually the main part of the immune system of the brain. Trying to get rid of beta amyloid would be comparable to saying, man, all that pus that you developed in that injury, if we just totally knocked out the immune system, you wouldn't get any pus at all. And it's true. If you just knocked out the immune system completely, you'd never generate pus or boils or anything. pus is a sign that your body's doing its job in fighting the battle to try to destroy that pathogen. So you don't get rid of the immune system to get rid of the pus. You help the body process the after effects of a strong immune system. So trying to get rid of beta amyloid at its origin is actually a very, very insane approach to trying to manage Alzheimer's. And that's where all the money is right now. I mean, literally billions of dollars is going into that. I wouldn't touch a medicine like that, ever take it, even if I was told they had tons of beta amyloid. You want to get rid of the old, you want to help clear the pus, right? You don't want to kill the immune cells. So the beta amyloid is being produced because there's an infection or a toxin in the brain that otherwise would kill you. Okay? So we got to address the triggers that cause the inflammatory changes, the low-grade infectious molecules or pathogens that are getting into the brain. That's what's causing the problem. We got to improve the immune system, not destroy it. Okay? So that's why that is so critical. It all ties together. So, that might be a good place to stop, actually. This is just the beginning. This is just the beginning. You know, we could go all night, and that's not healthy, so we're not going to. This topic is literally a topic where I actually personally have about 30 hours of lectures on it. So we're not going to do that tonight. Okay, so there's all kinds of more coming. Tomorrow, we're going to be looking at the issues of stress and what are the most important critical aspects to deal with stress in our lives. Tomorrow early evening, we're going to be really getting into this type 2 diabetes area and look at specific strategies that could help you optimize your health from an insulin resistance perspective. Once again, this is just kind of to whet all of our appetites to help us understand that this Diabetes Undone program starting on Sunday isn't just for people who've been diagnosed with diabetes, even though it's especially beneficial to those of you who have diabetes or pre-diabetes. But it's also important for all of us because essentially all of us have some level of insulin resistance. And all of us have an average risk of developing Alzheimer's. Me included. Okay, we're all at risk. Okay, that's normative. But it's also very possible for us to actually begin to, by evaluating what our risk factors are, it is very, very possible. In fact, I would say likely, if we actually address it, to dramatically reverse that risk and to even dramatically reverse aspects of that cognitive decline that's already taken place in our body physiology. So there's hope. There's definitely hope to undo that risk. So let's maybe end with a word of prayer. Dear Father, we are so grateful that there is hope, that there is an opportunity for us to move forward with energy, with expectation that something really can be done, that there is reason to put effort into improving our health because improvement of health and even reversal of various conditions is possible if we work with the right individuals and the right groups that know how to do this. So, Lord, we pray that you'll give each of us wisdom, that you'll guide the decisions that we make, and that you will especially bless each person and family represented here tonight, that you'll guide them. And we look forward to the blessing that's to come. In Jesus' name, amen. Do we have any time for questions? Or?
We won't do any questions right now. We'll probably save them for tomorrow. Dr. Youngberg has authored a couple of books, at least. One is called Goodbye Diabetes, and then followed another book called Hello Healthy. And I don't know how he came up with that one.
Makeover.
And Memory Makeover coming.
This
So
summer.
he's brought a few books with him. They will be available for sale, and he probably will be glad to autograph the book for you tomorrow night after tomorrow night's presentation. So we welcome you to join us tomorrow. His presentation tomorrow morning will be the main part of our worship service, starting at 10:45 in the morning, and then he'll also be speaking later in the day at 5:30. You're welcome to join us for a healthy lunch after the morning service. For those of you who want to sign up for Diabetes Undone, we have a limited number of spots that we're going to do for this class, but we still have openings. So if anyone is interested, you can stop and sign up in the foyer tonight or tomorrow night, because the program will start Sunday, and it starts Sunday morning with lab tests and measurements. So, and then the first class is Sunday afternoon at 4 o'clock. So, again, thanks for coming, and we hope to see you tomorrow. Any real pertinent questions? Sunday, what are you asking about? It's this Sunday. The Diabetes Undone class classes will start this Sunday, day after tomorrow. Yes. Oh, you can talk to him about it. All right. So we'll see you tomorrow.